Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
First real snow of the season arrived as if St. Mary Mead had simply decided to speak in whispers. Lanes grew muffled, hedgerows turned soft and white, and the village green looked like a picture on the lid of a biscuit tin. Chimney smoke rose in neat threads, and the bells of St. Andrew's rang a practice peal that sounded farther away than it ought. Miss Jane Marple watched it from her sitting-room window, knitting steadily, her needles clicking with the quiet persistence that made other people think she was not listening. Outside, a boy slid on a frozen puddle near the duck pond and landed with a squawk. His mother scolded him with worry dressed up as anger. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The world produced the same kinds of boys in every generation. That afternoon, Emily Bartlett arrived with cheeks pink from the cold. "I'm collecting holly for the church," she explained, stamping snow from her boots. "For the midnight carols, Reverend Hartley insists we must look seasonal even if we all catch pneumonia. It sounds very cheerful," Miss Marple said. "It's bigger this year," Emily went on, lowering her voice as if the cat might gossip. "We're joining with Witchwood Hollow. Their roads are blocked, their hall boiler has failed, and their vicar is in a state, so Reverend Hartley thought we should host them. After the service, we're all going to Foxglove Hall for hot punch and mince pies." "Foxglove Hall belongs to Mrs. Pritchard," Miss Marple murmured. Emily's mouth tightened into a look that was almost respectful. "Yes, she's delighted. She wants the parish newsletter photograph, of course, and she's arranged a special treat. Something at midnight exactly, a solo." "At midnight exactly," Miss Marple repeated, as if noting a stitch. Emily nodded eagerly. "Mr. Oliver Crispin will be there too. He's staying at the hall, advising Mrs. Pritchard about her investments. Very polished. People say he sang in a famous London choir as a boy." "People say many things, Miss," Marple replied mildly. When Emily had gone, Miss Marple sat quite still for a moment. Foxglove Hall was a handsome old house, half ivy and half pride, standing a little beyond the village like a watchful aunt. Mrs. Pritchard entertained in December because she liked an audience, and she liked reminding people that she could afford one. Miss Marple had met Oliver Crispin once at a summer fete. He had praised her lavender biscuits with such practiced warmth that it had felt like a ribbon tied around an empty box. Charm, she had learned, could be genuine. It could also be a tool. The night of the carols arrived with the sky the colour of pewter and snow that fell without hurry. The church filled early, people brushing white from sleeves and stamping their feet against the cold. Candles trembled in their holders, turning faces into portraits and shadows into secrets. Reverend Hartley beamed as though he had personally arranged the weather for effect. Miss Marple sat in the front pew. Across the aisle, Mrs. Pritchard was upright as a poker, her hat a small fortress of velvet. Near her stood Oliver Crispin, hands folded, expression devout in a manner that could have been sincere or could have been rehearsed. At Mrs. Pritchard's shoulder hovered over her niece Charlotte, pale, immaculate, eyes too bright with the strain of trying to appear calm. When the clock struck 12, the solo began. It was clear and boyish, strangely sorrowful, rising into the arches and hanging there like frost. People held their breath. Miss Marple listened and noticed two things at once. Mrs. Pritchard did not look pleased, not even with her triumph, and Oliver Crispin did not sing a single note. Instead, he watched the side door, as though expecting someone to come in or someone to slip out. When the last amen dissolved into silence, he moved before anyone else, leaving his place with the smoothness of a man stepping off a stage. Lanterns bobbed as the congregation filed out, careful on the snowy path. Moonlight made the world bright enough that footprints looked like writing across the ground. Foxglove Hall appeared ahead, windows glowing gold, promising warmth and spiced punch. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of evergreen and polish. There should have been laughter, the clink of cups, the rustle of coats being shrugged off. Instead, there was a curious stillness. Mrs. Pritchard's butler stood at the foot of the staircase, his face drained of colour. "Madam," he said, voice unsteady, "I'm very sorry. There's been an incident." People stopped. Someone made a nervous little laugh that died quickly. Mrs. Pritchard stepped forward, outrage warring with fear. Others followed despite themselves. Miss Marple did not hurry. She watched Oliver Crispin near the coat rack, gloves in his hand, too composed for a man who had just been told of trouble in the house where he was a guest. Upstairs, on the wide landing where portraits frowned down, a shadow lay in the wrong place, too still for a house full of guests. The steward, Mr. Hollis, was half-turned as if he had been reaching for the banister. A dark stain spread beneath his temple, shockingly vivid against the pale carpet. Near his outstretched fingers, something small and metallic caught the candlelight, only a glint, easily missed in the confusion. Outside, the snow kept falling as softly as ever, indifferent to human horror. Miss Marple looked not at the blood, but at the tiny details around it. A crushed sprig of holly under a shoe, a damp footprint that should not have been there yet, and the way Mrs. Pritchard's eyes flicked, just once, toward Oliver Crispin before she forced them back to the dead man. By morning the snow had thickened into a muffling quilt, laid so evenly across the lanes of St. Sed's that even the hedgerows looked softened and innocent. Chimneys smoked in straight disciplined lines, and the village seemed to have agreed, by some unspoken pact, to speak more quietly than usual, as though a louder voice might disturb something sleeping beneath the drifts. It was precisely that hush which made the news so startling. Mrs. Hartnell at the post office had only been open 10 minutes when people began arriving in 2s and 3s, stamping the snow from their boots and asking for stamps they did not need. They lingered at the counter with the air of shoppers who had forgotten their purses. They wanted, quite plainly, to be told the same thing again, because repetition gave it shape. They found him in the schoolhouse, Mrs. Hartnell announced in a tone that suggested she had personally discovered the body and also personally disapproved of it. Poor Mr. Percival Gant, behind the stage curtains of all places, as if he'd been hiding. The word moved through the room like smoke. It was an attractive explanation, better than the ugly alternative that someone had pushed him, struck him, done something that could not be undone. Miss Marple arrived for her ration of gossip in the most ordinary fashion possible, carrying a small basket and wearing a hat that had seen many winters. She took her place near the rack of postcards and listened, her mild eyes seeming to rest on a display of peppermint drops while her attention gathered every remark. "Who found him?" asked Mrs. Elspeth Crane, the baker's wife, who had baked an extra loaf in anticipation of a quiet day, and now looked as though she might regret it. "Mr. Phelps," said Mrs. Hartnell, "the caretaker. He went to light the little stove for the rehearsal, though heaven knows why they're rehearsing in this weather. And there he was, cold as, well." Mrs. Hartnell stopped herself because there were children's ears nearby, but everyone supplied their own ending. Dr. Haydock, breath steaming, arrived next, having trudged down from the surgery with the briskness of a man whose duties were very often interrupted. He had the look of someone who had already said the worst sentence aloud and did not care to repeat. "It was no accident," he said flatly, and the room grew still in a way that made the tick of the wall clock sound indecent. A blow to the head. One clean, forceful strike. A ripple of dismay, then something sharper underneath it. Excitement dressed up as outrage. "And the police?" demanded Mrs. Crane. "Inspector Slack is on his way from Market Belling," Dr. Haydock replied, "but he may have trouble getting through. The roads are treacherous." "Trouble getting through," Mrs. Hartnell repeated, brightening at once. "Well, that's just it, isn't it? Whoever did it, if it was one of our own, can't simply slip away. We're snowed in, like one of those dreadful tales you hear. A murder and nobody can leave." Miss Marple bought her stamps, her peppermint drops, and said, as though commenting on the quality of flour, "It does make one think of human nature, doesn't it? How quickly people decide what must be true." Mrs. Hartnell beamed, taking it as an agreement. Outside, the village wore its new fear awkwardly. Curtains twitched. Doors opened a fraction, then closed again. Across the green, the schoolhouse stood with its windows blank, as though it had turned its face away. A strip of red and white tape had been tied across the entrance, ludicrous against the purity of snow. The air itself seemed to resist sound. Even the crows in the bare oaks were subdued. At Foxglove Cottage, where the vicar had thoughtfully invited Miss Marple for luncheon to keep her from exerting herself unnecessarily, the sitting-room had become a small parliament. People found reasons to call, delivering casseroles and condolences with the same hands. Miss Marple sat in the corner with her knitting and appeared to be a harmless guest, the sort one could forget as easily as a footstool. The vicar's wife, Jane Weatherby, poured tea with a tremble she tried to hide. Percival only came to help with the winter fund, she murmured. He said he wanted to make amends. For what? Asked the vicar, too gently. Jane's glance flicked to the window. For the way he treated the village committee, for being sharp with people, for threatening, oh, it sounds melodramatic now, but he did threaten to close the lending library in the hall if we didn't agree to his terms. Terms. Mrs. Elspeth Crane had made herself comfortable on the sofa, with the air of a woman settling in for a long story. He wanted control of everything. He wanted to decide what the funds should be used for, and he wanted his name on the new plaque, and he wanted Miss Larkins dismissed. Miss Larkins, the young schoolmistress, was not present. That absence itself was noted in a dozen minds, and in several of them it began to look like significance. Mr. Gant was very hard on her, Jane admitted, lowering her voice as though the walls might repeat it. He said her pupils were behind, that she had no discipline, that she was sentimental, and he said it in front of others. He had no tact, said Colonel Bantry's visiting nephew, Hugh Bantry, who had been stranded by the weather and seemed to find the situation both inconvenient and faintly interesting. But tactlessness isn't usually a hanging matter. The phrase caused Jane to flinch. Dr. Haydock had returned and stood by the mantel, warming his hands. "We oughtn't to start trying and sentencing people before Slack even arrives," he said, but his eyes went to the doorway again, as though expecting someone. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She said, "When people are frightened, they like a neat story. If you can name the villain, you feel a little safer. Then who is it?" Mrs. Crane demanded at once, as though Miss Marple had offered to reveal a prize. The vicar spread his hands. "We do not know, but they all supplied suggestions anyway, because not knowing was unbearable. There was Victor Hale, the innkeeper's son, who had been seen arguing with Mr. Gant last week about a debt. There was Mrs. Dalloway, the widow at the edge of the village, who had received a legal letter and had cried at the post office. There was even, whispered with relish, the idea of poachers from the woods, outsiders conveniently wicked. And Miss Larkins?" Mrs. Crane pressed. "Where is she this morning?" Jane looked pained. "She is indisposed. She sent word through her landlady that she has a fever." "A fever," Mrs. Hartnell echoed from the doorway. She had arrived without anyone quite noticing, or a guilty conscience. Miss Marple lifted her gaze, mild as milk. "Fever does come at odd times," she said, "but then so do guilty consciences, don't they? Though guilty consciences usually show themselves in little ways. People forget their gloves, or they are very, very particular about wiping a cup." She looked down at her knitting as if the remark had escaped her by accident. Dr. Haydock's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing medical, my dear doctor." Miss Marple smiled. "Only when someone has done a dreadful thing, they are sometimes surprisingly eager to look normal, too eager. They chatter, they offer help, they tidy. It's quite touching, really." In the pause that followed, the room seemed suddenly crowded with hands and teacups and small movements. Jane set the pot down a fraction too firmly. Mrs. Crane smoothed her skirt twice. Hugh Bantry's smile faded. Outside, somewhere down the lane, there was the crunch of boots in snow and the distant clink of metal, like a gate being lifted. The sound carried oddly in the winter air. "The police," someone whispered, as though saying it might summon them faster. Miss Marple continued to knit, her expression unchanged, but her eyes, if one had been watching closely, moved toward the window again. Snow could seal a village like wax over a letter, keeping secrets safely inside. But secrets had a habit, she knew, of pressing against the seal until the smallest crack appeared. Inspector Slack arrived just before noon, bringing with him a gust of cold air and an atmosphere of official displeasure that cut cleanly through the village's anxious murmuring. He stamped the snow from his boots at the vicarage door, removed his hat with a resigned sigh, and accepted a cup of tea as though it were a necessary inconvenience rather than a comfort. "I don't like snowbound villages," he announced, glancing around the crowded sitting room. Everyone watches everyone else, and nothing useful gets said until it's too late. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, inclined her head as if agreeing with a statement about the weather. Slack began his work methodically. He visited the schoolhouse first, accompanied by Dr. Haydock, and returned with a grim expression that did nothing to discourage speculation. The blow, he confirmed, had been delivered from behind. Death would have been swift. There was no sign of robbery. Mr. Gant's wallet, papers and watch were all intact. "Which means," Slack said later, addressing the assembled villagers with deliberate bluntness, "that this wasn't chance, and it wasn't greed, it was personal. Personal was a word that landed heavily. It suggested familiarity, proximity, and history." People shifted in their chairs. Miss Marple listened as names were offered, retracted, and offered again in altered form. Victor Hale had quarrelled with the dead man about money, yes, but Victor had been drinking at the inn all evening, and half the village could attest to it. Mrs. Dalloway had received a legal notice, but she had not left her cottage during the storm. Miss Larkins, the schoolmistress, remained ill in bed, her landlady insisting she had been shivering with fever since before dusk. "Convenient," someone murmured. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mantel clock. People who were genuinely ill, she reflected, rarely inspired such certainty in others. That afternoon, she walked carefully through the village, leaning on her stick more for effect than necessity. Snow muffled her steps, allowing her to approach conversations unnoticed. Near the green, she paused by Mrs. Dalloway, who was scattering crumbs for birds with a nervous precision. "They'll say it was me," the widow said abruptly, as though Miss Marple had voiced the thought aloud. "Because he frightened me, because I cried." "Crying," Miss Marple said gently, "is a very poor indicator of violence." Mrs. Dalloway laughed weakly. "You're kind to say so." At the inn, Victor Hale scrubbed the counter with unnecessary vigour. "He threatened me," Victor said bitterly. "Said he'd have me hauled before the magistrate. But I didn't touch him. I was angry, not mad." "Anger," Miss Marple replied, "does not always lead where we expect, but it does leave marks." Victor stared at her, then shook his head and turned away. It was near dusk when Miss Marple encountered Miss Larkins for the first time that day. The young schoolmistress stood at the edge of the lane, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale but alert. She seemed startled to see. "I felt a little better," Miss Larkins said quickly, before Miss Marple could speak. "The fever broke." "That's fortunate," Miss Marple replied. "Fevers have a habit of clearing at inconvenient moments." Miss Larkins flushed. "People think dreadful things." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They often do when frightened." They walked together for a short distance. Miss Marple noticed that Miss Larkins avoided the path leading toward the schoolhouse, choosing instead the longer way round. "You must have found Mr. Gant's visits trying," Miss Marple said conversationally. Miss Larkins's mouth tightened. He enjoyed correcting people, publicly. "Humiliation," Miss Marple said softly, "is a very particular kind of cruelty." Miss Larkins stopped walking. "Are you asking if I killed him?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I'm asking how people behave when they feel powerless." Miss Larkins's eyes filled briefly, then cleared. "Some people submit," she said, "and some people look for leverage." Miss Marple nodded, filing the words away. That evening, Inspector Slack called a smaller meeting at the schoolhouse, restricting attendance to those most closely involved. Miss Marple was included almost by accident, the result of no one quite remembering to exclude her. Inside, the room felt colder than it should have, the smell of chalk and damp wool lingering in the air. Slack stood near the stage, his notebook open. "Mr. Gant was last seen alive here," he said. "He'd come to inspect the hall accounts. Someone met him, someone he knew well enough not to fear." Miss Marple's eyes strayed to the stage curtains. They were heavy, practical things, drawn back now. One corner was creased as though it had been pulled aside hastily. "Who had access to this building last night?" Slack demanded. "Most of us," the caretaker replied. "Committee members, teachers, anyone with a key." "And who knew he was coming?" Slack pressed. There was a pause. Then Jane Weatherby spoke quietly. "He told me. He said he wanted to make an example." Miss Marple noticed how the word example caused several people to stiffen. Slack continued questioning, but Miss Marple's attention had fixed on something small and seemingly trivial. Near the stage steps, where the snow from boots had melted into dark patches, there was a faint smear, chalk perhaps transferred to wool. Chalk dust did not travel far from its source, and it did not cling easily unless brushed deliberately. Miss Marple said nothing. She rarely did at the moment of discovery. As the meeting broke up, she lingered behind, adjusting her gloves with care. Miss Larkins was nearby, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Children often carry chalk everywhere," Miss Marple said mildly. "It gets into cuffs and hems. Teachers must find it terribly persistent." Miss Larkins looked up sharply, then away again. "Yes," she said, "terribly." Outside, night settled once more over the village, sealing it in silence. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts moving with the steady assurance of long practice. Patterns were emerging now, not of violence, but of pressure, of small humiliations, private fears, and the quiet certainty that exposure would ruin everything. Snowbound villages, she reflected, did not create crimes. They merely prevented people from running away from them. By the following morning, the snow had hardened into a brittle crust, sharp enough to bite at the ankles, and St. Mary Mead felt tense in a new way, less shocked, more defensive. The first astonishment had worn off. Now people were choosing sides, quietly and with great seriousness, as though allegiance itself might be mistaken for innocence. Inspector Slack continued his inquiries with increasing impatience. He disliked villages at the best of times, and snowbound ones most of all. Too many doors, too many histories, and far too many people convinced they knew the truth already. He moved from house to house, boots thudding, notebooks snapping open and shut, gathering answers that sounded reasonable and therefore worried him. Miss Marple observed these movements from a distance. She had returned to her normal routine: tea at 4:30, a short walk when the paths allowed, knitting in the evening, because nothing unsettled people more than someone who behaved as though life were continuing quite calmly. It made them careless. She encountered Jane Weatherby in the lane outside the vicarage, her arms full of laundry frozen stiff as boards. "I hardly slept," Jane said, without preamble. Every sound felt like a knock at the door. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Guilt and fear both have excellent hearing." Jane flushed. "I didn't mean—" "I know," Miss Marple said gently. "You meant the village." Jane hesitated. Percival Gant was very determined about the accounts. He said there were discrepancies. Nothing illegal, perhaps, but embarrassing. Embarrassment, Miss Marple said, is often more dangerous than crime. Later that day, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at Mrs. Dalloway's cottage. The widow's sitting room was overheated, the air thick with lavender polish and nervous energy. Mrs. Dalloway poured tea repeatedly, as though the teapot might empty itself without constant supervision. "They'll never believe it wasn't me," she said, sitting opposite Miss Marple and gripping her cup too tightly. "He sent me letters. Legal ones, threatening ones." "Threats," Miss Marple said, "are usually meant to frighten, not to be acted upon." Mrs. Dalloway laughed shakily. "That's easy to say when one isn't frightened." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "On the contrary, my dear, I've known many frightened people." As she left the cottage, Miss Marple noticed Victor Hale leaning against the inn wall, smoking with the air of a man daring the world to challenge him. "They're looking at me again," he said sourly. "Because I argued with him, because I'm loud." "Loudness," Miss Marple replied, "is rarely mistaken for subtlety." Victor snorted. "I wanted to hit him sometimes. Doesn't mean I did." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "Wanting is not the same as doing." That evening, Inspector Slack called once more at the vicarage, this time requesting Miss Marple's presence directly. He did not look pleased about it. "You notice things," he said gruffly once they were seated. "People tell me you always do." Miss Marple folded her hands. "People tell me many things. It doesn't mean they're correct." "I want your opinion," Slack said. "Off the record." "Opinions," Miss Marple replied, "are very rarely off the record. They tend to resurface." He frowned, then plunged ahead. "Miss Larkins, the schoolmistress, she had a motive, opportunity. She was humiliated by the man. and she claims illness at a convenient time. Convenience, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, is not always calculated. Sometimes it is merely clumsy. Slack stared at her. You think she didn't do it? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Miss Larkins is afraid of disgrace, not discovery. Slack's mouth tightened. Explain. She is anxious about her position, Miss Marple said, about how she is seen. That makes her cautious. People who commit sudden violence are rarely cautious afterwards. They are either reckless or relieved. And she is neither. She is watchful, Miss Marple said, and watchful people leave earlier. Slack muttered something unprintable and stood. Then who? Miss Marple rose as well. I would like to see the schoolhouse again, she said. They went together, lanterns swinging, the snow squeaking beneath their feet. Inside, the building smelled of chalk and damp wood. Miss Marple moved slowly, her gaze drifting from floor to walls to stage, as though admiring a familiar room. She paused near the curtain once more, then bent with some difficulty and brushed at the hem of her glove. Chalk, she said mildly. Yes, Slack snapped. It's a schoolhouse, but not everyone brings it home with them, Miss Marple replied. Children do, teachers do, caretakers less so. She straightened and looked at the stage steps. Mr. Gant was struck from behind. Whoever did it knew where he would stand, and knew the room well enough to approach silently. You're saying it was planned, Slack said. I'm saying it was anticipated, Miss Marple corrected. Slack exhaled sharply. This is going nowhere. Miss Marple smiled faintly. On the contrary, it's going somewhere very specific. As they left, she glanced once more at the doorway and noticed a small scuff in the snow just outside, one footstep overlapping another, as though someone had waited there briefly, then retreated. Waiting required patience. Patience required familiarity. That night, as Miss Marple sat by her fire knitting steadily, she considered the village again, not as a collection of suspects, but as a network of habits. Who arrived early, who stayed late, who unlocked doors without thinking, who resented oversight not because it threatened them, legally, but because it stripped away authority. Control, she reflected, was a powerful drug, and when threatened, it often lashed out. The pattern was not complete yet, but it was close, very close. Snow lay quiet outside, concealing footprints that would soon reappear, and when they did, Miss Marple intended to be watching. The next day brought a curious mixture of thaw and tension. The snow began to soften at the edges, shrinking away from doorsteps and walls as though retreating from scrutiny, yet the village itself seemed more tightly wound than ever. St. Mary Mead had reached that uncomfortable stage where speculation hardened into conviction, and conviction demanded confirmation. Miss Marple took her walk later than usual, choosing the hour when people believed they had finished their most urgent conversations. She moved slowly, pausing to admire nothing in particular, allowing herself to be passed by those who were eager to speak to one another, and not to her. It was remarkable, she reflected, how much could be overheard when one was assumed to be harmless. Near the green she encountered Mrs. Dalloway again, this time in the company of Colonel Bantry's nephew. Their voices dropped as Miss Marple approached, then resumed with exaggerated casualness. "They'll never prove anything," Hugh Bantry was saying. "There's no weapon, no witness, just feelings." "Feelings are dangerous," Mrs. Dalloway replied. "They make people imagine things." Miss Marple smiled to herself. Feelings, she knew, also made people betray themselves. At the schoolhouse, Inspector Slack had arranged another round of questioning, more focused now. His irritation sharpened into determination. Miss Marple arrived to find Miss Larkins seated stiffly on a bench, her hands folded, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Chalk dust clung faintly to the cuff of her coat. Slack paced. "Miss Larkins, you admit you were upset by Mr. Gant's remarks." "Yes," she said quietly. "Anyone would be." "You admit he threatened your position?" "Yes." "And you admit you were in the village that evening?" "Yes." "Then why," Slack demanded, "did you tell your landlady you were too ill to be seen?" Miss Larkins' voice trembled. "Because I was afraid of what people would say." "People will say plenty regardless," Slack snapped. Miss Marple watched her closely. Fear was there, certainly, But there was something else too, a careful restraint, as though Miss Larkins were holding herself in check. "You didn't go to the hall," Slack continued. "You didn't confront him." "No," Miss Larkins said. "I stayed home, and yet," Slack said, "chalk dust like this suggests you were here recently." Miss Larkins looked down at her sleeve and flushed. "I teach children," she said. "It never quite goes away." "That's true," Miss Marple said mildly, and Slack shot her an annoyed glance. The questioning ended inconclusively. Slack dismissed Miss Larkins with a warning not to leave the village, which was unnecessary advice under the circumstances. She left quickly, shoulders hunched, as though eager to escape the building itself. When the room emptied, Miss Marple lingered. She examined the stage again, the steps, the narrow space between curtain and wall. She imagined Percival Gant standing there, reading a ledger or rehearsing a speech, confident in his authority. She imagined someone approaching from behind, not in haste, but with resolve. Later that afternoon, she paid a call on the caretaker, Mr. Phelps, who lived in a small cottage behind the hall. He welcomed her with the wary politeness of a man unused to attention. "I didn't hear anything," he said at once. "I was home early. My wife can tell you." "I'm sure she can," Miss Marple replied. "Caretakers are rarely thanked enough for what they notice." He shifted. "I only do my rounds." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "You know who comes in early, who stays late." Phelps hesitated. "Mr. Gant came often, always checking something." "And who else?" Miss Marple asked. Phelps frowned. "Committee members, Jane Weatherby sometimes, and Mr. Crispin once or twice." He said he was helping Mrs. Pritchard. "Mr. Crispin," Miss Marple repeated. "He sang at the carols." "Yes," Phelps said, "a smooth one." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her thoughts turning over the name. Oliver Crispin had been visible, admired, conveniently placed, and yet something about him felt too polished, too obviously suspect. People like that, she had found, were rarely careless enough to leave chalk dust or overlapping footprints. That evening, she invited Jane Weatherby for tea. The vicar's wife arrived flustered, apologizing for everything from the weather to the sugar. "I feel as though the village is pulling itself apart," Jane said. "Percival was difficult, yes, but he meant well." "Meaning well," Miss Marple said gently, "is often the beginning of trouble." Jane sighed. "He said he'd publish the discrepancies. He said sunlight was the only cure." "And how did people respond to that?" Miss Marple asked. Jane hesitated. "Some were grateful, others furious." "Fury," Miss Marple said, "usually belongs to those who feel exposed." Jane's eyes widened. "You think it was someone from the committee?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that it was someone whose authority depended on silence." When Jane left, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire, knitting steadily now, the pattern familiar and reassuring. She thought of Percival Gant's insistence on order, of Miss Larkins' fear of disgrace, of Oliver Crispin's polished charm. And then she thought of someone else. Someone who unlocked doors without thinking, who moved through the hall as though it belonged to them, who bristled at oversight, not because it threatened their livelihood, but because it challenged their position. The next step, she decided, was not to accuse, but to provoke. People who relied on control did not respond well when it was gently removed. Outside, the snow continued to melt, revealing paths and prints that had been hidden for days. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The village was beginning to show her where to look. The opportunity to provoke arrived sooner than Miss Marple had expected, carrying on a small gust of official irritation. Inspector Slack announced that he intended to examine the committee records publicly, in the schoolhouse, and invited any member who wished to attend. The invitation, though phrased as a courtesy, carried the unmistakable weight of pressure. It suggested scrutiny. It suggested exposure. And, Miss Marple thought, it suggested that certain people would find it very hard to sit still. The meeting took place late in the afternoon, when the light was already thinning and the thaw had left the path slick and treacherous. Miss Marple arrived early and took a seat near the back, close enough to hear but far enough to be forgotten. The schoolhouse smelled of damp wool and chalk, the air uneasy with expectation. Jane Weatherby was there, pale but composed. Victor Hale leaned against the wall, arms folded, his impatience obvious. Mrs. Dalloway sat rigidly upright, hands clasped as though in prayer. Miss Larkins slipped in quietly and chose a chair near the door, her eyes lowered. Oliver Crispin arrived last, removing his gloves with practiced elegance, his smile polite and faintly bored. Inspector Slack wasted no time. He spread a stack of papers on the table and began to speak about procedures, authorizations, and oversight. The language was dull, but its effect was not. Miss Marple watched faces instead of listening to words. Jane Weatherby followed closely, nodding when expected. Victor Hale grew restless, shifting his weight. Mrs. Dalloway stared fixedly ahead. Miss Larkins remained still, her breathing shallow but steady. Oliver Crispin, however, leaned back with apparent ease, his gaze drifting to the windows, to the stage, to the corners of the room. He looked like a man waiting for something to end. Then Slack did. Exactly what Miss Marple had hoped he would. Mr. Gant intended to publish his findings, he said bluntly. He believed transparency was essential. He had arranged to address the committee here, in this room, on the evening he was killed. A ripple passed through the group. Miss Marple felt it like a change in temperature. He expected resistance, Slack continued, and he told at least one person that he feared someone might try to stop him. There it was. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes on Oliver Crispin. Crispin's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. His fingers paused on his gloves. He glanced toward Jane Weatherby, then quickly away. Slack pressed on. Who knew Mr. Gant would be here alone that night? Silence followed, heavy and deliberate. The caretaker did, someone said at last. Yes, Slack agreed. But the caretaker had no quarrel with him. Who else? Jane Weatherby swallowed. I knew, she said. He told me. So did I, Victor Hale said shortly. He told half the village. He did not, Miss Marple said quietly, and the room turned toward her in mild surprise. Mr. Gant was very particular. He chose his confidants carefully. Slack eyed her. And who were they? Miss Marple smiled apologetically. That would be for Mr. Gant to say, Inspector, but he is not here. The meeting dissolved shortly afterward, the tension unresolved but sharpened. People left in small clusters, voices low, eyes alert. Miss Marple remained seated, appearing to struggle with her gloves. Oliver Crispin approached her with a courteous inclination of the head. A chilling business, he said. Villages do love their dramas. Only when forced, Miss Marple replied mildly. They prefer their routines. Indeed, he said, one mustn't disturb them. Some disturbances, Miss Marple said, are necessary. His smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. You sound very certain. Certainty, Miss Marple said gently, is usually borrowed. He laughed softly and excused himself, but Miss Marple noticed that he did not take the shortest route out. Instead, he paused near the stage, glanced toward the curtains, and then continued on. Later that evening, Miss Marple paid another visit, this time to the vicarage. Jane Weatherby received her with visible relief. I'm glad you came, Jane said. I don't know what to think anymore. That's quite all right, Miss Marple replied. Thinking comes later. They spoke quietly over tea. Jane confessed her worries, about the committee, about the village, about having supported Percival Gant until it became uncomfortable to do so. He said someone would try to silence him, Jane admitted. I thought he was being dramatic. People who speak of silence, Miss Marple said, have usually heard it threatened. As Miss Marple left, she took the long way home, passing the schoolhouse once more. The building was dark now, but as she approached, she noticed a thin line of light beneath the door. She stopped listening. There was a sound inside, paper being moved perhaps, or a drawer sliding shut. Then footsteps. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadow just as the door opened. Oliver Crispin emerged, startled to find anyone there. Miss Marple, he said smoothly. I thought everyone had gone. I often forget to leave, she replied. Did you misplace something? Just curiosity, he said lightly. One likes to know what one is being discussed about. Of course, Miss Marple said. Curiosity can be quite motivating. He smiled again and walked past her, his steps careful on the slick ground. Miss Marple waited until he had gone, then approached the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the schoolhouse smelled faintly of dust and ink. On the table where Slack had spread his papers, something lay slightly out of place, a ledger not fully closed, its pages disturbed. Miss Marple did not touch it. She did not need to. The message was clear enough. Oliver Crispin had returned alone to a room associated with exposure. He had not come in fear, but in irritation. Control had been challenged, and someone who relied upon it had just revealed how much that challenge mattered. Miss Marple stepped back into the night, satisfied. The final piece, she knew, would come not from documents or footprints, but from a reaction, sharp, instinctive, and unmistakable, and she intended to invite it. The village woke the next morning with a brittle cheerfulness that fooled no one. Snowmelt ran along the gutters in thin, icy streams, and the paths glittered treacherously in the pale light. St. Mary Mead had reached the stage at which certainty was both desired and feared. People wanted the business ended. They did not want the ending to point too close to home. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, private satisfaction as she buttered her toast. Irritation, she had learned, was far more reliable than guilt. Guilt hid, prevaricated, and wept. Irritation bristled. It was corrected. It returned to rooms it had no reason to enter, and touched papers it did not own. Oliver Crispin's late visit to the schoolhouse had been exactly that sort of bristle. She set out late in the morning, choosing her hour with care. The inn was quiet, Victor Hale nursing a mug with the exaggerated innocence of a man who had been suspected too often to take it seriously now. The post office hummed with subdued conversation. Mrs. Hartnell's voice lowered when Miss Marple approached and rose again the moment she passed. All of it was familiar, reassuring, and just a little dangerous. At the vicarage, Jane Weatherby received her with visible relief. "Inspector Slack is coming again this afternoon," she said. "He wants everyone present. He says he's close." "Closeness," Miss Marple replied gently, "is relative." Jane frowned. "I don't like how Oliver Crispin looks at me, as if I ought to know something." Miss Marple sipped her tea. People often look that way when they're hoping someone else will do their best for them. After luncheon, Miss Marple went to the churchyard. The snow had retreated from the grass, leaving it damp and dark, the stone paths slick. She stood for a moment by the low wall, watching a robin hop with resolute purpose. It was the smallest creatures, she thought, that adapted quickest. She heard footsteps and turned to see Oliver Crispin approaching, his coat buttoned neatly, his smile affable. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're indefatigable." "Habit," she replied. "One finds it comforting. I wondered if I might ask you something," he said lightly. "Off the record." "Records," Miss Marple said, "are everywhere." He laughed, a sound carefully measured. "You've been very attentive," he went on. "People talk, they always do," Miss Marple said. "It saves thinking." He glanced toward the church door. "It's extraordinary how quickly a village can turn on a person." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Extraordinary how slowly it can turn away." His smile faltered for just an instant. "You think I'm enjoying this?" "I think," Miss Marple said kindly, "that you dislike disorder." He drew in a breath, then exhaled. "Disorder is inefficient, and inefficiency," Miss Marple said, "can be intolerable to those who value control." He regarded her for a moment longer, then excused himself, his steps careful on the wet stone. Miss Marple watched him go, noting how his shoulders remained set, as though bracing for impact. The afternoon meeting gathered in the schoolhouse again, the air thick with anticipation. Inspector Slack stood at the front, his notebook closed for once. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the back, knitting bag at her feet, her presence accepted and ignored. "I'm going to be plain," Slack said. "Mr. Gant was killed by someone who knew he would be here alone, someone who knew the building and someone who feared what he would say. We've chased anger, we've chased embarrassment, now we'll chase the timing." He turned to the caretaker. "You unlocked the hall early." "That night?" "Yes," Phelps said, "for the committee papers." "And who else had a key?" Slack asked. "Committee members," Phelps replied, "and guests at Foxglove Hall sometimes when meetings ran late." A murmur. Eyes moved. Miss Marple felt it then, the shift, the tightening. Slack continued. "Mr. Gant arranged to meet a financial advisor earlier that evening, a man with a choir background who attended the carols. He expected advice on how to present his findings." Oliver Crispin straightened. "I advised Mrs. Pritchard," he said smoothly, "not Mr. Gant." You advised both, Slack said, according to your own calendar. Crispin's mouth opened, then closed. Advice isn't murder. No, Slack agreed. But anticipation can be. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Inspector, she said, her tone apologetic, may I add a small observation? Slack hesitated, then nodded. Mr. Gant was struck from behind near the stage, Miss Marple said. The chalk smear suggested a familiar path, not a chance encounter, and the footprints overlapped, as though someone waited, then followed. Waiting requires patience. Following requires confidence that one will not be questioned. Crispin's eyes flicked to her, sharp now. This is absurd. Is it? Miss Marple asked gently. You returned to the schoolhouse last night alone, after being publicly associated with exposure, not to hide, but to check. People who hide avoid rooms like that. Slack stepped forward. Mr. Crispin, where were you between 9 and 10 on the night of the carols? With Mrs. Pritchard, Crispin said promptly. Jane Weatherby spoke before she could stop herself. Mrs. Pritchard sent him away early. She said he was agitated. Silence fell. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Mr. Crispin, she said, you sing beautifully, you understand timing, you knew the building, the audience, the moment when attention would be elsewhere, and you believed disorder would ruin everything you had arranged. Crispin's composure cracked. Then, not into tears but into irritation. He had no right, he snapped, no right to parade figures like a morality play. He would have destroyed reputations. Yours? Miss Marple asked softly. He laughed. Harsh now. I manage outcomes. And when an outcome threatened to manage you, Miss Marple said, you removed it. Inspector Slack's hand closed on Crispin's arm. That will be enough. Crispin looked around the room, taking in the faces. Some shocked, some grimly satisfied. You think this ends things, he said. Villages forget. They do, Miss Marple agreed. But not quite the way you mean. As Crispin was led away, the room exhaled. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her hands steady. The pattern, she thought, had always been there. It had only required the right pressure to reveal it. Outside, the light faded and the snowmelt slowed. St. Mary Mead would sleep easier tonight, believing itself restored. Miss Marple knew better. Control had been challenged, not eliminated. It never was. But for now, the silence had been broken, and sometimes, she reflected, that was enough. In the days following Oliver Crispin's arrest, St. Mary Mead moved as though it were walking on newly mended ground, solid enough to bear weight, but still tender beneath the surface. The thaw continued, water running steadily along the lanes, carrying away the last traces of snow and leaving behind a darker, softer earth. People took this as a sign that things were returning to normal, though no one was quite sure what normal meant anymore. The schoolhouse reopened quietly. Chairs were set straight, chalk trays cleaned, and the stage curtains drawn back as if nothing remarkable had ever happened there. Children returned with the irrepressible resilience of youth, their voices filling the room with a brightness that felt almost defiant. Miss Larkins taught her lessons with careful composure, though she avoided the stage steps without seeming to notice she did so. The chalk dust returned to cuffs and hems, persistent as ever, and Miss Marple reflected that some things could not be scrubbed away, only lived with. Mrs. Pritchard issued a brief statement through her solicitor, dignified and restrained, expressing sorrow for the unfortunate events and confidence in the proper course of justice. She did not invite the village to Foxglove Hall again that winter. Its windows still glowed in the evenings, but the light felt more distant now, less performative. Influence, once questioned, did not regain its former warmth easily. Inspector Slack remained for several days, tying up details and taking formal statements. He seemed less irritable than before, though not more comfortable. Snowbound villages, he admitted to Miss Marple during one of his visits, left a man with the uncomfortable sense that order was something borrowed rather than owned. You were right, he said gruffly. It wasn't anger. It was controlled. Miss Marple nodded. Anger burns hot and fast. Control smoulders. Victor Hale returned to his inn with renewed vigour, enjoying the relief of being ordinary again. Mrs. Dalloway began attending morning services she had previously avoided. her posture a little straighter as though surviving suspicion had lent her unexpected strength. Jane Weatherby threw herself into parish work with quiet determination, determined that no single person should ever again hold so many keys, literal or otherwise. Talk of the murder faded, as talk always did, replaced by disputes about drainage, the spring fete, and whether the hedges along the green ought to be cut back sooner. Yet beneath these familiar irritations ran a thin current of caution. People paused before speaking. They weighed complaints more carefully. Authority was no longer assumed to be benevolent simply because it spoke confidently. Miss Marple noticed this most clearly in small moments. A committee meeting where questions were asked politely but firmly. A ledger examined twice instead of once. A decision postponed rather than rushed through for the sake of efficiency. These were not grand reforms, but they mattered more than people realized. One afternoon, as the air softened into something that promised spring, Miss Marple walked to the edge of the village where the lane dipped toward the fields. The ground there was muddy now, the last snow long gone, and footprints overlapped freely without meaning. She paused, watching a pair of crows argue noisily over something unidentifiable, then laughed softly to herself. Even nature, she reflected, understood the importance of claiming ground. Mabel joined her, linking her arm through her aunt's. "Do you think it's really finished?" she asked. "For the moment," Miss Marple replied. "That's usually the most honest answer." Mabel was quiet for a while. "It frightens me," she said at last, "how close it all was. How easily we might have believed the wrong thing." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Belief is very economical. It prefers shortcuts." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room and took up her knitting, which she had set aside during the busiest days. The pattern was familiar, soothing in its repetition. Outside, the village settled into its evening rhythms, doors closing, lamps being lit, voices drifting briefly before fading. She thought of Percival Gant, earnest and unyielding, convinced that transparency alone could cure every ill. She thought of Oliver Crispin, polished and efficient, convinced that outcomes justified methods. Both had been certain, both had been wrong in different ways. Human nature, she knew, did not respond well to absolutes. As the days lengthened, St. Mary Mead grew more confident in its recovery. Laughter returned to the green. Children played there again without being hurried away. The bells rang on Sunday with a steadiness that suggested reassurance rather than triumph. Miss Marple listened from her pew, hands folded, her expression serene. The village had not been purified by its ordeal. Nothing so dramatic had occurred. But it had been reminded, briefly, perhaps uncomfortably, that vigilance was not a vice, and that quiet observation often served better than loud certainty. After the service, several people thanked her in careful, indirect ways, as though afraid to name what she had done. Miss Marple accepted their words with gentle deflection. Gratitude, she believed, was best left unexamined. That night, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple paused by the window and looked out across the darkened lanes. The ground was bare now, the snow only a memory, but she could still picture how it had sealed the village in, forcing truths to the surface. Silence, she reflected, was rarely empty. It was full of things waiting to be noticed. She drew the curtains and turned away, content to let the village rest. There would be other winters, other gatherings, other moments when ordinary life cracked just enough to show what lay beneath. When they came, Miss Marple would be there as she always was, quiet, attentive, and underestimated. For now, St. Mary Mead slept, believing itself safe again, while understanding lingered just beneath the surface, as patient and persistent as the thawed earth itself. Time, which had seemed so thick and reluctant during the days of snow and suspicion, began to move more freely again. St. Mary Mead slipped back into its habits with the quiet efficiency of a village that preferred not to dwell. The murder was spoken of less often now, usually in lowered voices and with a faint air of embarrassment, as though it had been an indiscretion rather than a tragedy. Miss Marple noticed the change most keenly in people's faces. Lines of tension softened, shoulders relaxed, conversations resumed their familiar patterns of mild complaint and gentle pride. It was not that the village had forgotten Percival Gant, nor even Oliver Crispin, but that both had been carefully placed into the category of things that were finished. Inspector Slack departed at last, his work done, his relief only partially concealed. On the morning of his departure, he called at Miss Marple's house, hat in hand, his manner less brusque than when he had arrived. "I don't suppose I'll ever like villages," he said, accepting a cup of tea, "but I'll grant this one thing. They don't give up their secrets easily." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "they prefer them to be comfortable." He hesitated, then added, "You were a help, more than I expected." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Expectation is a dangerous thing, Inspector. It encourages oversight." He almost laughed, then thought better of it, and took his leave. The village council met again the following week, this time to discuss far more ordinary matters. Miss Marple attended briefly, sitting near the back, listening as new procedures were approved and responsibilities redistributed with great solemnity. There was a conscious effort now to share authority, to prevent any single voice from carrying too far unchecked. Whether it would last was another matter, but the intention itself was revealing. Miss Larkins seemed transformed. The strain had not vanished entirely, but it had eased, leaving behind a quiet determination. She spoke more confidently at meetings, no longer shrinking from disagreement. One afternoon she stopped Miss Marple on the lane, her cheeks flushed from the walk. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "not just for everything, but for listening." "Listening," Miss Marple replied, "is very often enough." Miss Larkins nodded. "I've learned that silence can be dangerous. I don't mean to keep mine any more." "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is a sensible resolution." Mrs. Pritchard withdrew almost entirely from village life. Foxglove Hall remained immaculate, its grounds tended, its windows lit in the evenings, but the gatherings had ceased. When Miss Marple encountered her once at the grocer's, the woman's manner was cool but restrained, her authority quieter now, as though she were uncertain how loudly she was permitted to speak. "An unfortunate business," Mrs. Pritchard said stiffly, selecting a tin from the shelf. "It has taught us all to be more careful." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "care is often hard won." The spring fete went ahead as planned, though on a smaller scale. There were fewer speeches, fewer grand gestures. The children's races drew the loudest applause, their uncomplicated enthusiasm cutting through any lingering unease. Miss Marple watched from a folding chair, a paper cup of tea warming her hands, and felt a familiar contentment settle over her. Mabel joined her, laughing as she sat down. "It feels almost normal again," she said. "Almost," Miss Marple agreed. They watched as a gust of wind sent bunting fluttering wildly, tangling itself for a moment before settling. Order restored, Miss Marple thought, but only after a brief reminder of how easily it could unravel. That evening, as the fete wound down and people drifted home, Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village. The lanes were quiet, the air mild. She passed the schoolhouse, now brightly lit for a rehearsal, children's voices carrying out into the dusk. Life, persistent and unremarkable, asserted itself once more. At home, she resumed her knitting, the familiar rhythm soothing. Her thoughts wandered, not back to the crime itself, but to the subtle shifts it had produced. People spoke differently now, even if only slightly. Questions were asked where once assumptions had sufficed. It was a fragile improvement, easily lost, but real all the same. Human nature, she reflected, was neither improved nor degraded by such events. It was merely revealed. Control sought silence, fear sought certainty, and ordinary people, caught between the two, did their best to appear blameless. As night fell, the bells rang softly, marking the hour. Miss Marple listened, not for discord, but for the spaces between the notes. Those pauses, she knew, were where meaning often hid. She set her knitting aside and stood, stretching carefully. Outside, the village lay peaceful under the stars, unaware of how narrowly it had avoided settling for the wrong truth. Miss Marple felt no triumph in that knowledge, only a quiet responsibility. There would be other winters, other silences, and when they came, she would once again sit by her window, knitting, listening, and noticing the smallest things that others overlooked. For now, St. Mary Mead slept, confident in its restored order, while Miss Marple, ever observant, allowed herself the modest satisfaction of knowing that, this time at least, the silence had been made to speak. Spring completed its quiet takeover of St. Mary Mead with a thoroughness that suggested intention. The hedgerows filled out, the lanes dried, and the earth lost the last memory of winter's grip. Even Foxglove Hall, aloof and reserved, appeared softened by the season, its windows opened more often, its gardens tended with renewed care. The village looked outward again, confident that what had happened belonged firmly to the past. Miss Marple knew better, of course. Past events rarely stayed where one put them. They settled instead into habits, into the way people paused before speaking or glanced twice at a ledger before closing it. She noticed such things as she always did, without comment, without judgment. The trial of Oliver Crispin took place in Market Belling, far enough away that most villagers experienced it through second-hand reports rather than attendance. The facts, once stripped of speculation and village embellishment, sounded almost ordinary financial manipulation, fear of exposure, a calculated moment when opportunity aligned with irritation. Crispin maintained his composure throughout, speaking of efficiency and necessity, as though those words might still protect him. They did not. When the verdict came, it was accepted with a kind of solemn relief. Justice, people said, had been done. Miss Marple reflected that justice was rarely so tidy, but she allowed the village its comfort. Comfort had its uses. Life resumed its smaller concerns. There were disputes over fencing, over the placement of benches on the green, over whether the church roof truly required immediate attention. These arguments were conducted with familiar enthusiasm, and Miss Marple took this as a sign of recovery. Villages expressed health through pettiness. She encountered Miss Larkins one afternoon outside the schoolhouse, where children were being released in a joyous rush. The schoolmistress looked younger somehow, her posture more assured. "I've decided to stay," Miss Larkins said almost shyly. "At least, for now." "That sounds sensible," Miss Marple replied. "Running away is often overrated." Miss Larkins smiled. "I think I'd like to help shape things instead." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "that's how change tends to last." Mrs. Pritchard remained distant but correct. When Miss Marple passed her once on the lane, the woman paused, inclined her head, and said quietly, "You see very clearly, Miss Marple." "Only what is there," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Pritchard held her gaze for a moment, then moved on. Power, Miss Marple reflected, disliked being observed, but it disliked exposure even more. As the weeks passed, the murder became something that had happened rather than something that was happening. Children stopped asking questions. Visitors returned to the inn without lowering their voices. The village allowed itself to believe that vigilance could be relaxed again. Miss Marple sat by her window one evening, the light lingering longer now, her knitting resting unused in her lap. Mabel was arranging flowers nearby, humming softly. "Do you ever wish," Mabel asked suddenly, "that you could stop noticing things?" Miss Marple considered. "No," she said at last. "Noticing is simply another way of caring." Mabel smiled and returned to her flowers. That night the bells rang as they always did, steady and reassuring. Miss Marple listened, aware of how sound changed with the seasons. Winter bells were sharp and lonely. Spring bells carried further, blending into the life around them. The difference mattered. Before retiring, Miss Marple took a short walk along the lane, enjoying the mild air. She passed the schoolhouse, dark now, and the green, where the grass had been worn thin by games and gatherings. Everything looked ordinary again. That, she knew, was when people were most inclined to stop looking. She paused by the low stone wall near the edge of the village and rested her hand upon it. Stone endured. It was memorable. Human beings, by contrast, preferred to forget or to reshape memory into something more comfortable. Neither impulse was entirely wrong. What mattered, Miss Marple believed, was balance. Observation tempered with kindness, truth offered without cruelty. She had lived long enough to know that certainty was rarely pure, and that humility, however unfashionable, saved more trouble than confidence ever did. As she turned back toward home, she felt no sense of finality. Stories did not end cleanly in real life. They simply reached a point where one could stop telling them for a while. St. Mary Mead slept peacefully that night, unaware of how closely it had been examined, how narrowly it had avoided embracing a false explanation. Miss Marple did not feel pride in that knowledge. Pride was unnecessary. Responsibility was enough. Tomorrow would bring its routines, tea, letters, mild disagreements, small kindnesses. Somewhere, perhaps not here, another quiet pressure would build, another ordinary moment would fracture. When it did, Miss Marple would do what she had always done. She would listen, she would watch, and she would remember that the most dangerous silences were not empty at all, but full of things waiting to be understood. With that thought, she closed her door against the soft spring night and allowed herself the simple luxury of rest, knowing that vigilance, like human nature, never truly slept, but could, for a time, be trusted to wait.